The base is divided into two parts: the monolith area, which means sharp edges, smooth surfaces, and on the other hand the rocks. I wanted to create some sort of alien technology or structure that melted into the rocks, sort of a juxtaposition of smooth and sharp versus rough, irregular, and textured. Starting with a mix of black and weathered stone, I'm trying to bring out some value differences, and I'm creating a bit of texture by basically dry brushing across the surface and leaving some areas a bit darker. Gradually mixing in more of the gray. And I'm continuing with the theme of picking out the edges in a more controlled way. At this point I thought I would just build the values and then cover it with washes of ink. That's why I spent so much time here. Doing this in hindsight, I would not have needed so much attention to detail here because I worked on the edges and details a lot after I applied those washes. I think either approach can work though, depending on how much time you want to invest. Just building the highlights and then using the inks on top is probably faster, but will most likely not give you as much contrast. I suggest that you try what works better for you. I try to stay away from gray rocks as much as I can now because that can easily look boring, but the approach here was to add color through the inks, as you will see. I did decide against it later, however, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's a smoother area in the middle of the stone that is due to the sandpaper grid being too big. It didn't matter for the rest of the paint job, just bear in mind that the grid of your sandpaper also has influence on the painting later. Using burnt umber, I apply the first layer to create the initial brown tone and darken the areas I want shaded. Burnt sienna adds a really interesting red rust tone, and I'm gradually switching between the two of them until I find the right variations that I want. I'm adding a bit of battered black to the palette and add it where I want the inks to be darker. Note that this is all making it up as I go. I really like to do that with bases because they are forgiving in that way and it's also fun. I wanted the rocks a red hue, so I took red oxide. I shaded that with washes of Bada Black, and I also used that on the areas where the two elements met to tie them together. The idea is that even though they are different material, they have been in the same environment for a long time. And I continue to shade the monolith because I wanted it darker. One idea I had was to make the rocks gray again, so I mixed a bit of the red oxide with gray and painted the rocks a light gray with darker shadows and the red still shining through from the cracks. The idea was, as the monolith got darker, having contrasting rocks would be a good idea, but it doesn't change the fact that gray looks kind of boring. But I left it alone for the time being and went back to the monolith. You can see I'm also using gray for the edges, which pushes the contrast greatly. But maybe save the timestamp and then later, as I put a lot more color, namely turquoise, into those edges, I wanted to come back and compare the two. I definitely wanted structure on the panels of the monolith, so I began experimenting with streaks on the side, which worked fine. On the surface facing up, I tried to also come up with some interesting ideas. Of course you could leave it finished like this, but I wanted to create additional variation. Remember when I said the surface ended up too smooth because of the grit of the sandpaper? That means I couldn't simply dry brush over the surface, so I had to do some sort of painting to create the texture and variations. I knew I had to do something to switch up the colors, so I put a mix of weathered stone and deep ocean and a lighter turquoise or blue-gray on the palette, the last one being maggot gray. Those are cold colors and they will make a good contrast against the warm red and brown shades. I added some turquoise halo effect to the gray streaks and also touched up the edges in turquoise. And I kept adding variations of colors to the streaks and all edges. You can see that adding more of the warm color increases the contrast massively again and brings back a lot of vibrancy. I keep using burnt umber and sienna on the monolith. starting to dab on some edge highlights again, and I realized I still didn't like the intensity of the discolorations enough in the middle of the platform. So I picked apart a blister sponge and randomly dabbed it into the dark and bright turquoise. So I took up some paint with the sponge and dabbed it on the surface randomly. This finally gave me a satisfying structure for these parts, and the last thing left to do was to apply final highlights on the edges and a bit more contrast variation to the streaks. I tried to only pick out the higher edges, and I definitely don't want to cover everything that is an edge. It is the same principle as with edges on round shapes. The angles all face in a different direction, and we want some gradients in there, and only a few lighter spots. After an initial wash to make the recesses darker on the rocks again, I started applying Mornfang Brown to create the red-brown midtones. And I'm mixing in gradually more and more pale sand. Applying it in a dry brush fashion first and then picking out details more precisely, especially edges on cracks and other areas that make for good contrast. If I feel like just mixing in pale sand is too desaturated, typically what I do is I add some skin tone color, for example flat flesh. I didn't want to add earth in the cracks this time, but I definitely wanted a dry feeling to these areas, like they are collecting sand and dust. I added mixed pigments, standard rust, old rust and Vietnam earth to the palette and mixed it with water. I started by dabbing on old rust where dust would collect and in the lower areas of most rocks. So looking at them from below is where I put them. I also add some standard rust to the monolith areas that look weathered to simulate some actual rust and degradation. I let most layers dry to see how they looked, and only then adjusted with brighter and darker steps as I saw fit. Whenever I felt like I added too many pigments or too opaque pigments, I just use a damp brush to wipe them off of the higher areas to keep the highlight colors. I was also dabbing on some of the standard rust onto the darker areas of the monolith to add more variation and tie the two elements together. For a lighter sand effect, I mixed MIG pigments Gulf War sand and Vietnam earth. You can see the result in the lower right area of the palette. Dabbing on maggot white again in an irregular pattern also on the ruined part of the monolith where the pigments dulled down the edges. And I finally added one last layer of sienna in one of the corners of the monolith and wherever I wanted to bring back some saturation. And I repeated to pick out details on the edges. Using Filet Model Air Black, I was correcting the edges of the plinth. I really like this color for that purpose because it leaves a satin gloss finish that I don't like so much on miniatures, but here it works perfectly. I really like how the base ended up looking green and red at the same time, and it's hard to make out where the color actually shifts. I also like how it extends down into the black. I guess I'm just a sucker for stuff like that. As always, if you have any questions, hit me up on the Discord, and I'll see you next video.